Hello and welcome to Safest Houses. We're your hosts,
I'm Alistair.
and I'm Kate, and here to guide you on how to make houses safer so it's you and not the next natural hazard that decides your future. In this episode, we'll cover what natural hazards are, which natural hazards we have in New Zealand, and how to find out which natural hazards can affect your house before they happen. So, Alistair, I feel like we should start at the very start. What is a natural hazard?
The start is always a very good place to start. So before we talk about like specific hazards, I think it's really important to clarify what we mean by a natural hazard. Most people know what it is, like it's an earthquake, it's a volcano, like that's what a natural hazard is. But kind of if we get a little bit technical, the definition of a natural hazard or a natural phenomenon is a natural event or a process that has the potential to cause harm to people, property, or the environment. So something that happens in nature all around us that if we put things in the way that we value can get harmed. So these natural hazards, we have lots of names for them, and that's probably what you're much more familiar hearing. Things like earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, landslides, storms, flooding, wildfire. I can go on. There are many names for natural hazards, and that's just like more specific ways of talking about what those things are. What's quite interesting is that we all kind of think we know what a flood is versus, say, what a landslide is. But it actually can be quite hard to define exactly where one starts and where one stops. Because, for example, you can have a landslide that comes off the side of a hill and you go, yeah, that's a landslide. But then some people say, well, if it keeps moving and it interacts with water, then it continues to be a landslide all the way down the valley. But then a lot of us would say, but that's a flooding and that's flood sediment. So it's a very interesting space. But ultimately, you kind of know what natural hazards are by that definition, right, Kate?
I think that's a general good overview. Yeah.
I think the other thing to think about is that these are just natural processes. So quite often it's quite a Western way of terming things when we call these things a hazard. And living in New Zealand, we have a different perspective with the Te Ao Māori perspective. So I think volcanoes are a really good example there, where we talk about, for example, Mount Taranaki, who is an ancestor. And the same for like the Wanganui River. So, kind of, this is where we have our Western science view of these are hazards that can impact us versus these are natural things that we live alongside and that are important to the environment. So, they're all the same thing. There's just lots of ways of looking at it.
Cool. And what's one thing that you probably won't hear us say, Alistair, when it comes to natural hazards?
We probably won't and definitely won't be calling them natural disasters. And I think that's really important. We make a distinction, at least here, Kate and I. This is something we get kind of nerdily passionate about. They're not natural disasters. So there's a hazard. It has the potential to cause harm, but it's just a natural process. The thing that when we get disasters, it's when we've put something that we value kind of in the way and it gets damaged by natural hazards. Now, in some cases, natural hazards are so big that there's not really too much we can do about it. But in almost every case, the disaster happens because we may have built in the wrong place, or we might not have built strong enough. And that means that the disaster itself is kind of a man-made event. If we didn't have things that we valued in the way of the natural hazard, then it wouldn't be a disaster. Is that how you kind of think about it, Kate?
Yeah, totally. And I think, one of the important things to think about is that these are all kind of based on our decisions and what we value as well. And there's so many things that we can do to also like reduce our exposure to these natural hazards.
Definitely. I think that's the important thing, and the hopefully empowering thing is that quite often we hear natural disasters in the news and you just kind of think, oh well, it's a fact of nature that disaster was always going to happen, that building was going to fall over. Like it's just an unfortunate reality. Whereas we're here to tell you that's not the case. There's so much you can do to make your houses much safer in the face of these natural hazards. And so that's why we won't say natural disaster, we'll say natural hazard. So now that we've got that technicality out of the way, what natural hazards do we have in New Zealand, Kate?
Oh my gosh, Alistair, I think we have them all.
Lucky us. Aren't we so lucky?
It's definitely part of our landscape. So New Zealand lies on the boundary of two tectonic plates, which means that kind of shapes what our like earthquake landscape looks like, our volcanic landscape. We also have like this massive coastline as well, which also helps to shape our tsunami risk as well. And then because we've got these beautiful mountains that have been created by these plate tectonics, it means that we've also got relatively steep terrain for landslides. And of course, when we bring in our like powerful weather systems and also, weather interacting with land as well, it means we've got these like beautiful rivers all across the country as well. And so, our beautiful landscape is also what shapes our hazardscape as well.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
pretty sure it was Sir Geoffrey Palmer that said, "If you want drama, you've come to the right place." When it comes to New Zealand,
Well, we definitely have drama, and I think we're going to have more and more drama in the future as well as we also add in the changing climate as well to that hazardscape. Um, but of course, we do have good news. It's not all bad news, because not all natural hazards affect us everywhere in New Zealand, which means we've got some areas that are higher risk and other areas that are lower risk for different events. But you might have noticed I didn't say no risk.
no, there's always risk, but there's ways and places that we can be that do have less exposure to these natural hazards.
Yeah. So if we were to talk about earthquakes, Ellie, where would you say we have like higher risk versus lower risk?
Well, that's a matter of perspective, I'd say, Kate. This is a guy who's come all the way from Blighty. I would say New Zealand has pretty high earthquake risk, to be perfectly honest. But we do have areas that have higher risk again. So we're looking particularly in Wellington. Everyone knows Wellington is exposed to a lot of shaking, um, but also we have a big tectonic plate boundary that comes up the west coast. You might have heard of the Alpine Fault. So that's a very strong area of earthquake risk. And then that flows through the Wellington region and then up the East Cape. That's offshore, but you can still have really large earthquake shaking affecting the land because of that plate boundary. So there's lower earthquake risk in Auckland and Northland than there is in those other parts of the country.
Yeah. And then when it comes to our volcanoes, what does our risk look like from that?
My favorite hazard, if you're allowed to have a favorite hazard. I love volcanoes. But yeah, if you're looking for things that might affect you from a volcano, the North Island's where it's at. So Auckland itself is sat on a volcanic field. Not necessarily the smartest place to build our most populous city, but it is where it is. So anywhere in kind of the central Auckland area could be affected by a volcano underneath it. We then also have the Topor and the Topor volcanic zone, which basically flows up from Topor Lake all the way up through Rotorua and then up off the North Island. That's a very active volcanic area, which is why we get all those geothermal activity in that area. So I just went on holiday there. Makes for a lovely hot water stream. Recommend it highly. We also have the Central Plateau, which has our volcanoes right in the center of the country. Mount Ruapehu, amongst others, in that area. And then over on the east coast, we have Taranaki, which is our large conical volcano, the most classically shaped volcano that we have in this country.
Cool. And then I guess it comes to our tsunami risk as well. So New Zealand being a relatively coastal area, have tsunami risk all up and down our coast as well as our lakes as well, because we often forget to mention our lakes, but our lakes also have risk from earthquake causing like landslides into the water, and can send waves going across the lakes as well. Our largest, I guess, source of risk is actually from our plate boundary, because it gives us like relatively short amount of time to
Mm.
evacuate areas. But we also have our regional source, so further afield from near Lake Tonga, up near the Kermadec Trench, all the way to our distant source events. So we're also at risk from earthquakes over near Chile as well. So a whole range of, sources for us to think about when it comes to
Yeah, it's
tsunami.
quite crazy that an earthquake in Chile can then cause impacts over here, but that's just how the energy waves work within the ocean. So that then you can have tsunami inundation over here. We won't feel the shaking, but we will get the waves.
Yeah. And it's nice
Absolutely.
though with that one is that we do have, a decent amount of warning before anything arrives at our coast.
Yeah,
Whereas flooding can also take us by surprise sometimes. What sort of flooding do we
absolutely.
usually think about?
Well, a lot of the time when we think about flooding, we think, yeah, near rivers, right? And then some people might also go, yeah, flooding from coast, because sometimes that's termed in lots of different ways. But coastal hazards or coastal flooding, those sorts of things. But it's also really important to think about overland flooding, which can just happen from impermeable surfaces, or so sometimes that's like your concrete or your tarmac, or if we haven't had a lot of rain, then the water can flow off the land really, really fast. And that in certain areas can build up quite quickly. So that's where you might get some kind of much more localized flooding, which sometimes is quite hard to predict. That's kind of your short, sharp storms that can mean that you get flooding of houses. Next time you're in a very heavy rainstorm, have a think about where all that water that's flowing down the street, where's it ending up? Is it ending up in the river or is it ending up in a low point in the land?
So that's what we often call our surface flooding,
Yeah,
and usually occurs in those urban areas because of those concreted surfaces.
yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Um, we've covered quite a lot of them. Other than landslides, I say is probably one of the big last one that remains. So these happen a lot in our steep areas. So most landslides we're not really aware of. They happen in our kind of alpine areas. All within the Southern Alps, away from, well, fortunately, landslides happen in steep places and we don't tend to build on steep places. So that helps quite a lot. But there are certain places like Wellington, where we build on steep places, which are quite exposed to landslides. You might have heard landslides also be called landslips, or just slips. But these can happen in lots of different ways, and they can also happen from the likes of cliff erosion. So if you build your house on the edge of a cliff, then you might have some then like the water underneath the cliff, or even wind action can just mean that the cliff itself erodes, and then that might mean that the houses sitting on top of the cliff are vulnerable to damage.
Cool. And I think one of our most frequent is our severe weather. So when we're talking about severe weather, we're talking about storms, cyclones, strong winds, heat waves, drought,
Mm.
snowstorms. So it's quite wide and all encompassing a severe weather event. And there is like quite extremes there, from like wet to dry. And also those events have different impacts depending on where we are. So, um, and I guess when we come back to our house and what that kind of looks like for our property as well.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about things like drought, you kind of get into that area of, okay, well, what is this natural hazard again? Because sometimes that's not often brought up as a natural hazard, because it's a longer term impact and it might be something that affects, for example, farming industries or kind of other parts of the economy. You might not, a drought's unlikely to affect your house directly. It wouldn't do a huge amount of impacts to the structure, but it can have much more kind of widespread impacts over a long period of time. It can also it can also mean that there's increased vulnerability to other things, like if you've got really dry land around you, then there might be more chance of wildfire that can then do that kind of short, sharp damage to your property. So those are the kind of things where there's this whole range of different scales that hazards happen upon.
Mm.
Um,
So when we're really like looking at those range of natural hazards, Really, what we're concerned about when it comes to our property is like earthquake shaking and liquefaction to our property, ash and laharis potentially to our property,
Yeah.
tsunami, inundation, flooding from, our severe weather events, landslide in terms of damage to our property as well. And then kind of those severe weather, it's like strong winds, um, and more kind of leading into that flooding, right?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount we can go into here, and we're gonna have to keep ourselves on topic. But maybe in the future we can have a conversation as we can do a podcast on kind of the different kind of direct impacts to properties as well, because that's the important bit, right? Is kind of okay, great. These phenomena can happen, but what actually does that mean for me, and what can I actually do to make my house more resilient to those things? But like if we're thinking about where the hazards are happening, um, given that we're not all nerds that know where all the hazards in New Zealand are off the top of our head, a bit like us, how do we think we can go about finding out where natural hazards might affect like me and my house?
There's a few different places that you can find it. So most people, when they're looking to buy a house, they will approach the council for their LIM report, a land information memorandum. And so that's something that you have to pay for because the council gathers all that information up for you. If you're not doing that process right now in terms of like looking for a home, then the other ways that I'd recommend would be looking at your regional council's hazard maps. So on these hazard maps, it will have all the available hazard information for that council. It is now responsibility for all councils when they have new hazard information for them to share it publicly. So hopefully, most councils do have like an online hazard viewer, but the quality of that like hazard information also depends on how much that council has invested in, those maps and those models. Councils that don't have too much money may not have as much data available as in comparison to like our larger councils. And Alistair, I also know that you know a good way to find out natural hazard information too.
Yeah, I think and before we get to that, I think what's also worth bearing in mind with those different councils is sometimes it gets into the nitty-gritty. So on your limb, the council will say like we've got information down to the property level, whereas councils might also have information at different scales. So you can kind of look at a kind of broad brush scale, okay, where's most likely to flood in this area in my suburb, for example. So you can look at that kind of level, but that doesn't mean that then we have the information right down to the individual property. I think that's kind of a little bit difficult to understand because sometimes you think, well, surely I want to know where the line on the map is that the flooding will stop, right? But unfortunately, that's just not really how modeling works. It works at different kind of scales, and that's how we create these maps is through hazard models. So sometimes, so basically, when you run a model, you decide what the scale of the model is going to be. Like, are we going to run this on a 1 by 1 meter resolution or like 100 by 100 meter resolution? It just means the modeling can change where we can the how close to the ground we can say we've got an accurate estimate of where the hazard's going to be.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess the best example of that, Alistair, is like on your computer mouse when you zoom in and out. It's like, what scale of that, you know, document or website are you looking at? And it's the same with like our natural hazard mapping. Hey, so it could be at like a property level or a regional level. And then we also have, national level hazard layers as well, which are a bit more refined.
Definitely, yeah.
I know
Definitely.
some people that are like so terrified about the fact of like living in a tsunami inundation zone that they've like purposely decided, not to live anywhere near the coast. And I also know people that love living by the beach and, they accept that there's that level of like tsunami risk and they have like their evacuation routes sorted as well. So I think everyone's going to look at these this information like really differently depending on, what's important to them and what they value as well. And
Yeah,
of
definitely.
course, I think it's important to mention here as well is that, we've got this, this information, which is like such a great resource of information, but also not all natural hazard layers will be there or be available. And so there's, you know, I guess a limit to it as well, in terms of what
Definitely.
is modeled. So for some events we may see like a major flood, but we don't see the extreme or like the severe flooding of what that flood zone would look like as well.
Yeah, and similarly, like for the example of of buying a house, for example, you need to do your due diligence on that precise property, and also kind of um, sense check it yourself as well. Sometimes there might not be, for example, a landslide map, but there's a massive hill above the house, so like you can kind of make your own judgment on some of these things. And if you're uncomfortable or you're not sure about that, that's when you can get your own a personalized geotechnical report or those sorts of things so that you can really understand the risk to that property itself. Because we haven't got that technical information on that high enough resolution for all houses in the country. So, but this is a really nice starting point, I guess.
Yeah. So a bit of research now can help you understand what you may be affected by. So you don't need to make like a bad decision that could really affect your future, especially when you're investing in, one of our biggest assets, which is our homes as well. So it can be complicated, but you also don't need to be an expert. Like, don't let it put you off looking at this hazard information. Use the resources out there, and ask people at the council as well. Talk to other people, and utilize the experts around you.
Yeah, contact your council, contact your civil defence. If there's information, they'll be able to point you in the right direction for where that information is.
Cool.
So, in this episode, you've learned what natural hazards are, which natural hazards we have in New Zealand, and then how to find out what natural hazards can affect you before they actually happen. So, please give us a follow and a share. Contact us to share what you've done so you're safe as houses. And we'll catch you next time.